Let's explore history's 13 most shocking punishments. Brace yourself for the unbelievable. Number 13, breaking wheel. Back in medieval Europe, there was a punishment that sounds more like something out of a horror movie than real life. It's called the breaking wheel, and no, it wasn't a quirky medieval way to travel. This wheel was all business and no pleasure, especially if you were a criminal. Imagine a large wagon wheel, except instead of hitting the road, bad guys were tied to it. An executioner, who probably never had problems finding a parking space for his massive iron hammer, would then get to work breaking the unlucky person's arms and legs. Wait, there's more, and it's not a set of steak knives. After turning bones into breadcrumbs, they would wave the poor guy through the wheel's spokes and then hoist it up on a pole like the world's worst flag. This was done in public, so everyone could see. People walking by would see the criminal hanging there, which was both a gruesome reminder and a very strong nudge to stay on the straight and narrow. The breaking wheel hung around for ages as the go-to gadget for teaching thieves and troublemakers a lesson. Number 12, elephants. Long ago in Southeast Asia, especially India, elephants weren't just gentle giants, they had a rather intense side job. These enormous creatures were trained by kings and rulers to carry out death sentences. Yep, you heard that right. These elephants weren't painting pictures or playing soccer, they were stepping on the bad guys. Imagine an elephant aiming right for the vital spots like the head or belly to ensure things ended quickly. Some elephants even had blades on their tusks. This was the ruler's way of showing they could control nature itself and keep everyone in line. Over time, as people started thinking maybe squishing people with elephants wasn't the nicest way to handle things, this practice thankfully came to an end. So, next time you see an elephant at the zoo, just be thankful it's only interested in peanuts, not justice. Number 11, the rack. In the dark corridors of the Tower of London, there was this device known as the rack. It was the time when guards called yeomen warders used this grim tool to stretch those accused of serious crimes like treason. They believed this would make them confess and reveal accomplices. A brave English writer and preacher named Anne Askew in 1546 tied to the rack. Despite the unbearable pain, Anne didn't give in. She kept her friends' names secret, showing incredible courage. Sadly, the torture was so brutal that Anne couldn't walk anymore. They had to carry her to her execution, where she was tragically burned at the stake. Number 10, the rat dungeon. Step into a dark, damp dungeon where rising waters bring the sound of scurrying fate. This was the grim scene in the Tower of London, a place where the use of rats and torture scared people beyond belief. Now, imagine the Dutch Revolt, where the horror grew even worse. Rats, desperate and wild, trapped in a hot cage against someone's stomach, biting deeply into the skin to escape the heat. Although this terrifying punishment started in medieval times, it continued into more recent years, showing up under cruel governments in South America. Number 9, keelhauling. Heading to the 9th punishment, which is keelhauling. On a ship with the sea crashing against it and barnacles clinging to its underside, sailors would gather on deck. They had a mix of fear and curiosity on their faces. A sailor, his hands tied and heart pounding, would be thrown overboard with a strong push. The rope would then pull him under the ship from one side to the other. Keelhauling started back in ancient Greece and was a severe punishment to keep sailors disciplined. It was famous in the 17th century Dutch Navy. In 1673, there was a well-known event where an admiral made a public spectacle of keelhauling to scare other sailors into following the rules. This method involved dragging a tied-up sailor under the ship from one side to the other, often causing serious injuries. Number 8, the oubliette dungeon. Oubliette was a medieval dungeon that sounded like it came straight from a wizard's spell, meaning to forget in French. Why? Because people thrown into these deep, narrow pits were meant to be forgotten by the world above. Here's how it went down. There was this trapdoor in the castle floor, and down you would go if you were out of favor. But this wasn't your average basement. It was so cramped, you couldn't lie down or fully stand up, just kind of exist in a dark, cramped space. No room service either, which means no food or water, leading to a very grumpy and eventually very quiet stay. Castles didn't just have moats and fancy flags, they had their own version of the naughty corner, except it was a pit and the timeout could last forever. Number 7, impalement. Impalement was a harsh way to punish people, used a long time ago in many places like the Ottoman Empire and Europe during medieval times. This method involved pushing a stake through the victim's body, starting from the lower part and coming out near the neck or shoulders. It was a slow process meant to cause a lot of pain, and sometimes it took days for the person to die. These stakes were shaped in a way that wouldn't kill the person right away, but they made the pain last longer. The most famous person known for using this method was Vlad the Impaler. He was a prince in the 15th century whose actions later inspired the legend of Dracula. Number 6. The rat bowl and tube. The rat bowl and tube punishment was a terrifying form of torture. A container or tube filled with rats was attached to a person's body, typically around the abdomen. The other end of the tube was heated. It made the panicked rats try to escape by burrowing through the victim's flesh. This method was not only extremely painful, but also caused great fear. It started in Europe and was later seen in South American dictatorships during the 20th century. This punishment was used to force confessions and scare others. Sadly, the terrible injuries and mental trauma often left survivors permanently damaged. Number 5. The leather sack. Imagine being zipped up in a leather sack, but instead of your cozy sleeping bag, you're sharing the space with some not-so-cuddly creatures like snakes, dogs, monkeys, and roosters. Now, picture this sack being tossed into a river or the sea. Sounds like a nightmare, right? Well, back in ancient Rome and medieval Europe, this was a real punishment called pena culae, especially reserved for people who committed the ultimate no-no, hurting their parents. Each animal in the sack wasn't just a random choice, they all represented the chaos the criminal caused. This made the punishment a bit like a dramatic symbolic show of the disorder they brought to their family. This method was more than just a way to punish, it was meant to clean up the moral mess and restore order. Number 4. Gibbeting human cages. Gibbeting, also known as hanging in chains, was a public way to punish and warn others using the bodies of executed criminals. This practice was common in England up until the 18th century. Here is how it worked. After a criminal was hanged, their body was placed in a metal cage shaped like a human. This cage was then hung from a tall post at busy spots like crossroads or harbors. The idea was to scare people off committing crimes by showing them the decaying body locked securely in its cage, exposed to the weather, but safe from animals. Gibbeting was reserved for the worst offenders. By 1834, it was stopped in the UK, seen as cruel too, and replaced by more humane ways of dealing with criminals. Number 3. Scaphism, the boats. Scaphism, also known as the boats, was a gruesome execution method from ancient Persia. The condemned person was trapped between two boats or inside hollowed-out tree trunks with only their head, hands, and feet sticking out. They were then force-fed milk and honey, causing severe diarrhea that stayed trapped with them. More honey was spread on their skin to attract insects. Over time, the person would suffer from infections, being eaten by bugs, and other terrible symptoms. They used to die from dehydration, shock, or organ failure. This method was extremely cruel and was used to instill fear due to its psychological and physical torment. Number 2. Blood Eagle. Imagine a dark tale from the time of Vikings. A story of a brutal punishment known as the Blood Eagle. The victim's back used to have a cut open, their ribs hacked away from the spine, and their lungs pulled out to look like wings. This wasn't just any punishment, it was a public spectacle meant to show the consequences of serious crimes like betrayal or hurting family members. Some historians argue if it really happened, or if it's more of a story than truth. But either way, the Blood Eagle remains one of the most chilling punishments from the Viking Age, showing their fierce ways of dealing with lawbreakers. Number 1. Brazen Bull. In this ancient world of Greece, the brazen bull was also called the bronze bull, and it was not an ordinary punishment. Crafted by Pervillos of Athens around 6th century BCE, this device was made entirely of bronze. There was this hollow bowl with a door which allowed someone to be put inside. Once locked in, a fire was lit beneath the bowl, heating the metal until it became scorching hot, effectively cooking the person inside. But that's not all. This bowl was designed to amplify the victim's screams, turning them into sounds like a bull's roar. Legend has it that Phalaris met his own fate in the bull he created, a cruel twist of fate showing the horror of his own invention.